Hi, welcome to Ridgepoint, and thank you for joining us today. Throughout 2023, we're doing a deep dive through the book of Psalms in our worship services. And today we'll continue that with a message from Pastor Joe about arguably the most well-known and probably the most popular psalm, Psalm 23. These words will likely be familiar to you, but Joe has some examples and some insight that I'm guessing will be new to you. So let's listen together now as we jump into week 12 of our study through Psalms.
Maybe you're like me and you don't read too much into signs and patterns, but earlier this week I couldn't help but notice a pattern developing in front of me on Monday morning. So last Sunday we had a great Father's Day together, and towards the end of the night, Avery, my 14-year-old daughter, she gave me a Taylor Swift playlist that she curated herself from Spotify, and she wanted me to listen to it with her, so I said I would. And so on the way to work, I was listening to Taylor Swift, and I'm becoming a bigger fan by the day because of Avery's influence in my life. And as I was listening to the songs and bebopping along, I thought to myself, man, how cool would it have been to try to get Avery to one of these Eras Tour concerts that Taylor Swift is having. She's breaking attendance records. People are just raving about the show. And I thought, man, I don't think there's tickets available. It's probably out of reach for a pastor like myself to afford one of those things. So maybe we'll have to try to catch it the next time around. But as I was thinking these things, driving to work on the highway, I kid you not, a Swift transportation semi merged onto the highway in front of me. And I'm like, this is wild. And I just kept, I kind of chuckled at it, kept driving to work, kept listening to the music, got to work, answered emails, went to some meetings, and I was in a late Monday morning meeting with Mike Hearn, who's our men's ministry director here. And all of a sudden I get this text message out of the blue from my sister Lindsay, who lives in LA. And she says, funny story, I was going to go to the Taylor Swift concert later this summer in LA, but my friend who's going to go with me can't go. Is there any way that you can get Avery to Southern California later this summer so she can go to the concert with me? And I know. And I was stunned to the point where like our meeting was derailed, and I felt bad for Mike because he wanted to get some stuff done, but I was just like floored. I hadn't mentioned it to anybody, hadn't posted on Facebook, and put it out there, and all of a sudden, like the things started falling into place. And I was just so grateful that Avery gets to go to see Taylor Swift. This occurrence is maybe a rather incomplete, but it's at least an introduction, little parable into what scientists call quantum mechanics. It's the way in which our universe connects with different parts of it. Instead of things having to be side by side spatially to interact with one another, for a long time now, scientists have wondered if there's a way that our universe works in a way that is kind of weird and unpredictable, as Albert Einstein once said. Like through terms like quantum tunneling and superposition, in quantum entanglement, we are now recognizing that the world can interact with itself, even though these elements may not be side by side. Now, even though it's dawning upon us in the science community, this is something that Christian mystics have been saying for quite some time, that the God of the universe enters into relationship with people, and there seems to be this quantum entanglement between us and God. Through our action and through our prayer, through a God that we cannot see, that seems far away, we seem so unusually connected to this God. Notice some of the language that we even find in the New Testament scriptures. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, it says this, though you have not seen him, you love him, and even though you don't see him now, you believe in him and are filled with inexpressible joy, for you're receiving the end result of your faith, the salvation of your souls. This is what Jesus said to his followers in the upper room the night that he was arrested, conveying his relationship with them. He says in John 14:20, on that day you will realize that I'm in my Father, that you are in me, and that I am in you. So this God in us and us in God seems to be one of the pillars of explaining Christianity, that in a mystery, the God of the universe is interacting with us. Now, even though the big story is that God is fixing the world and the whole universe, he's mending it back together, and he's fixing us in the midst of all this mess, there seems to be this critical part of the equation. God has decided that in order to get all the work done of mending the universe, that he wants to dwell inside of frail human beings like you and me. And as he does so, we begin to see change and transformation in our life. This is why when people choose to follow Jesus, almost without any effort, they begin to do things more loving and more considerate than they did in their past life. This is why when someone becomes a new Christian and they've got other people in their life, they begin to take notice that this person is a little different than they were a month ago or 3 months ago or 3 years ago, that they're on a journey of change. And when you ask that person, what's going on? Why are these changes taking place? The best I can say is, I don't know. It just seems like God has his hand on me. God's got a hold of my life. And I've got some different values and I want to do different things now. But the skeptic might say, but where is this God? How can you know for sure? I don't see this God next to you. How do you know that these changes that are happening in your life are really on the basis of God in your life? Listen, this question is vital and it's important, and every spiritual seeker grapples with it. Even seasoned Christians, we grapple with it from time to time. And when we try to explain, sometimes our words fall short. And sometimes, like, we try to sketch it out on scratch paper and we leverage metaphors from The Office and things like that to try to figure out, like, how can we explain this, but our words are simply too few. So we enter into this frame of knowledge that Michael Polanyi, who's a philosopher, he said it's called tacit knowledge, where we know more than we can say. And we seem to have all the evidence that we need. And even though I don't have all the answers, even though I can't answer it plainly, I want to keep walking with my God and build the road as I walk along with God. This year, we're covering 22 different Psalms during our different sermon series throughout the year. And these Psalms, as we investigate them and interpret the text, they also highlight some Christian teaching and some ideas for our Christian life as we go from Psalm to Psalm. So this morning, we're going to continue that, and we're going to cover Psalm 23. It's the most well-known psalm in all the Psalter. But I think what we'll see when we read Psalm 23 is that we begin to get notified of some key changes and some transformation that happens in the life of the believer as we walk with God in this relationship with him. And so we're going to just notify 3 of those things this morning. And as usual, if a question comes up as we read Psalm 23, you can follow the QR code on the screen. That sends me an email. And if there's some time at the end of worship service, I'll try to answer a couple of those as we conclude our time. But as we jump into Psalm 23, the best way that we can read Psalm 23 is to cover a couple of critical things. Something that happens in the last verse of Psalm 23 and something that happens in the first verse of Psalm 23. So let's take the last one first. It's a bit of a head scratcher why most of the English translations of the Old Testament end Psalm 23 with this phrase, "I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." If you've been here the last few weeks, you know that from time to time as we go through the Psalms, that this term Sheol comes up in the Psalms, which Pastor Brent has told us is like a window into the view of the afterlife for ancient Jews. Now, what we conclude as we look at those few references and as we take the big books off the shelf and see what scholars think about Sheol is that there's not an elaborate expectation of what might happen after you die in the early Jewish community. Now, contrast that with other nations and communities around them, like Egypt, where they came from out of slavery, which had an elaborate expectation of what happened after somebody dies. And so when you look at that split screen side by side, we have to ask a question, why is so little spoken of in the Old Testament about the afterlife when everyone else seems to be talking about it? Well, one of the conclusions that some scholars say is that God's incentive for Israel to follow him was not going to be based on what they would receive after they died. But the incentive that God wanted to impress upon his people is that out of all the people groups and all the nations of the earth, God selected Israel to be his unique people. That's the reason why they should follow him. That's the only incentive. So it's kind of a head scratcher to think that an ancient songwriter like David, with this in mind, would conclude this song with this type of an idea. But if we actually go back to the ancient Hebrew, where the Old Testament comes from, a better rendering of this closing line actually goes something like this: I'll keep coming to the house of the Lord the rest of my life. So the house of the Lord is there. I'm just going to keep on coming, a frequent customer, filling up the punch card, coming again and again to the house of the Lord for the rest of my days. Or to put it more plain terms, I seem to be in God's house all the time. Now, these are the summer months, and so maybe you parents and grandparents can resonate with this last statement, because it seems like you're always at the neighborhood pool, okay? You were there yesterday. weren't we just here yesterday? Like you begin to say to yourself. Or maybe you've got kids who play baseball or softball, so you're like, man, you look at all the rest of the parents on the bleachers and say, weren't we just here? Like, here we are again. Or maybe you like Sonic, and there's those half-price drinks during happy hour, and you're like, man, we seem to always be at Sonic during the summer. We're starting to memorize the names of all the people who bring drinks to us. Well, this is the dynamic that's happening in this closing line of the psalm. David's just recognizing that over time he's developed this pattern of chasing the presence of God in worship, which it kind of just leads to this question. Why did David develop this habit? I mean, he could do many things with his life. Why spend so much time in worship? That's why we go to Psalm 23, verse 1. As he starts off this song to God, he says, "The Lord is my shepherd." He's being led back again and again into the presence of God. He seems to be led there because he wants to spend more time with God. Now, there's many things that we could say about shepherds. They had a unique occupation from these communities, and we could maybe get to that another time. But the primary occupation of a shepherd was to lead a flock of sheep. And they knew where they were and where they wanted to go, and they had to try to keep all of those sheep alive. So if you take these two bookends to this psalm, the last verse and the first verse, we can conclude that this is what the psalm is all about. David seemed to develop a habit of worshiping God quite frequently because he wanted to be there with God. But that's not the only thing that Psalm 23 says. It's got some other content in it. So between worship services, God was leading David to other places. We can call them other stops on the path between back and forth to worship, and I want to cover just 3 of those stops this morning with the remainder of my time. The first stop is a restored soul. In the first stanza of this psalm, there's 5 different ideas that correlate with the main theme of being at peace with God. David says that because God is a shepherd, he lacks nothing. He's got no panic in his life. That he rests along green pastures. Ancient Palestine was not the state of Kansas. Pastures were few and far between, so if you came to a green pasture, it was kind of a sight to see. He says a third thing. He's led beside quiet waters. Once again, not many quiet streams in this part of the world. But he also says that when he's led by God, he's got a restored or refreshed soul. And then lastly, he journeys along the right path. He's not re-rendering his path on the GPS. He knows he's on the right path with God. Experiencing any or all of these 5 things leads to 2 conclusions. Number 1, you have nothing to be afraid of. And number 2, because you have these things happen in your life at this great pace, it must be that you're being enveloped by a greater love than you've ever known in your life. Therefore, your soul can be at rest. But we've got to talk about this idea of a restored soul. Because a restored soul connotes that it wasn't at peace beforehand. You can't have a restored anything if it wasn't broken before. If the soul has been always okay, we can't just march in there and say, hey, I've got a restored soul today. It just doesn't happen that way. But it was an upheaval, and now it's been brought back to a place of rest. Spiritual guides like Dallas Willard have told us that we tend to recognize our souls only in a season of unease and unrest. In his book, The Renovation of the Heart, he compares the soul to that operating software on our computers or the thing that runs our smartphones. And whenever everything's running fine and like the printer's working and everything's like the internet's fast, like we don't marvel at our operating software, do we? We just use our computer, we just use our phones. It's only when we're getting like the pinwheel of death again and again that we're like, hey, something seems to be wrong here, and it's time to call the help desk, and it's time to troubleshoot some of the problems. I think this is one of the issues that we have routinely with the Christian life, that we only tend to our souls when something is wrong, that we don't tend to our souls in times of pleasanthood. We only tend to our souls when something is on fire. And the problem with that is that along the way, we haven't been diligent about developing skills and habits of seeing our soul patch back together in those times of when it's pleasant. And so when in seasons when it's overwhelmed, we don't know if we have the habits and the skills of what it takes to put our lives back together. I've mentioned this once to our trending audience, and if you've listened to it, you probably heard this illustration before, but my dad gave me a great metaphor for the diligence of putting your soul back together and tending to the soul. he was listening to an interview with Warren Buffett, and Buffett was talking about diligence in life. And he used this great parable. He says, imagine that when you turned 16 and you got your first car, you were able to receive one for free. But the terms of receiving this car for free was that it was going to be the only car that you would ever get and drive in your whole life. So whenever it broke down, it didn't work any longer, you couldn't drive any longer. You better believe if you were driving under those terms, you would do the regular maintenance checkup. So whenever, like Eddie's Toyota emails you about coming in, you wouldn't ignore it, delete it, go on with your day. Like you would change the oil, you would balance the tires, you would, if somebody rear-ended you in the parking lot at Target, like you would want to fix it because this is the only car that you have. In the same way, Buffett says, you've only been given one life. We should regularly attend and diligently attend to all the issues that go on in life. After my dad heard this interview with Warren Buffett, he was going into retirement, and I've just been so impressed with my dad. In the first several months of his retirement, he's been diligent about patching some things up in his life, getting things prepared so he could hopefully have this long third act in the future, and I've just been so impressed by that. But it's also a parable for tending to our soul. We've only got one soul. It's the only one we're going to get. We're not going to be able to upgrade and lease a new one. In fact, as biblical scholars investigate all the different references to the soul, they say maybe the more better way to imagine it is that we are a soul with a lived experience. Therefore, it is imperative for us. This should be our main objective in life, is to tend to the soul in good seasons and in challenging seasons. This leads to an important question. Are you and I ignoring the check engine light that's been going off inside the soul? Have we been putting it off for another day when I've got a little bit more time, or when somebody finally notices my life is not together? Are we eager to try to bring regular maintenance to our souls so we have this great longevity with this precious gift that God has given us? Are we eagerly wanting to see our souls restored? Here's one thing that David tells us in this psalm, is that our shepherd, when he leads us to a restored soul. He leads us to a place of healing. The question is whether you and I will receive his leading, listen to his prompting, and engage in those necessary seasons of repair. It's scary to engage in a season of necessary healing. We take these steps where it's courageous, it's revealing, it's challenging, but what we can be promised is that God will be with us and he can lead us into that season of healing, which takes us to our next stop, which is shelter and rest. The very next stanza of the psalm centers on the idea of being comforted during dangerous settings. David says in Psalm 23, verse 4, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Notice the confidence that David has, that when he goes through a very scary situation, that God is going to be with him, even if evil persists there. But we've got to be particular about the promise in this stanza. The promise is that God is going to be with us. The promise is not that the evil is going to be chased away in that darkest valley. This has been an important feature in Christian discipleship as long as we've been able to retrieve it and read about it. There are times in which God will chase away the darkness that surrounds us in these dark valleys. But sometimes the darkness lingers. Sometimes it remains and it stays. But one thing that we can embrace is that God is with us even though the darkness is not chased away. And we're told that we can also engage and challenge this darkness. From the very beginning, Christians have been given twin commands as we walk through these dark valleys with the surrounding world around us. That we should model faithfulness in the midst of that dark valley, and we could even at times speak truth to power with all the boldness and courage that God gives us. But the second command that we've been given is to allow vengeance to be God's alone. Between these two commands, of speaking truth to power and leaving vengeance to be God's alone, is the license to engage the world, but to do so without taking matters into our own hands, and to try to be too thirsty and too heroic for God's sake. Peter told us that as we engage the challenges around us, he told this to this really the struggling and challenged congregation in 1 Peter. He says that whenever you engage with those who oppose you, do so with gentleness and respect. The Christian posture publicly is with gentleness and respect. Ecclesiastes gives us a similar warning from a different perspective as we engage with the world around us. It says in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, the teacher says, "Whoever digs a pit may fall into it. Whoever breaks through a wall may be bitten by a snake. Whoever quarries with stones may be injured by them. Whoever splits logs may be endangered by them." Once again, Psalm 23 gives us the license to pass through the valley and to get to a place of safety. But if you and I feel called along the way as we walk through that valley to engage the darkness, to challenge it with gentleness and respect, here's the admonishment that comes from Scripture: to look both ways before we cross the street, and to do so with gentleness and respect, and to watch over our own souls, lest darkness finds a way to take its root deep within us. This is what Nietzsche said as he watched people engage with the monsters in the culture around him, and I think it's also a warning for us. Beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. For when you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you. I'm afraid that this is the temptation of Christians, and we see stories from time to time of people who started on the right path, but they gazed way too long into the darkness, and darkness got inside of them. It's just worth noting that when we talk about spiritual warfare and teach on it from time to time, that it's only a small piece and portion of New Testament witness. But if you and I listen to some Christian preaching today, we would assume that spiritual warfare and chasing the baddies out there is the main attraction of the Christian life. But there's other options when going through the dark valleys than gazing deeply into the abyss. N.T. Wright once said that if you want to go through a darkness and the dark valleys, the way to get through that valley is to worship instead. He says, like in this great metaphor he gives, is if you want to chase back the weeds in your garden, there's a couple different ways that you can go about it. The first way is to stock your garden with some sturdy shrubs that chase the weeds away, that don't give them a chance to grow amid all the other things that are growing in your garden. The other option is to douse it with weed killer. Worship is planting the shrubs, engaging and looking into the abyss and allowing the abyss to engage with us is trying to douse something with weed killer. Here's an observation this morning. Some modern Christians would rather douse the garden with weed killer than to use worship as our weapon through the dark valley. Some Christians decide that it's better to use militant, snarling language than joyful singing as they go through the dark valley. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is this: how did you and I come to know Christ? Through militant snarling, through hot takes and memes, or through joyful singing and glad adoration that a Savior would have mercy upon us as sinners who are wandering away from Him? And this is a critical piece of our journey, because the last thing that the shepherd leads us to, the last stop on the journey of Psalm 23, is the most challenging of all. The last stop is to seek peace with people. David presents the biggest challenge yet towards the end of the psalm. This is what the language that he uses in verse 5. He says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows." Inevitably, as we engage and as we travel through the dark valleys, we're going to come at odds with people, and from time to time, we're going to be on the opposite end of an issue, an opposite end of a topic. We're going to be at odds with even people within our own family and loved ones, and so we have a decision to make. Do we dig trenches and get entrenched within our perspective, or do we find a way to have peace with people, even the people that we have something against? Someone once said that it's best to eat dinner with someone that you're trying to patch a friendship with or to reconcile with, because you have to put down your weapons in order to pick up your forks and to eat your meal. Here's the challenge. Our world is rigged towards ugliness and strife sometimes, but our shepherd leads us to reconciliation. Our shepherd leads us to prepare a table before our enemies and to get close to them in their humanity, to recognize the struggle that they're going through so that we might have sympathy for them, maybe even empathy for the experiences they've had in life. And as we get close to them, not behind a keyboard, not behind a screen, not behind ideologies, but actually life on life, we might actually have a chance to love them and to see their humanity. Brené Brown, famous author, once told us that it's hard to hate someone up close. And that's what Jesus is leading us towards, is to get close to people that we're at odds with and to see if we can't reconcile. In the Christian life, we must have the courage to have an open conversation with someone that we're at odds with at least once. So at least one time, sit down and try to reason together and try to settle, and even if we have to part ways, which might be the wise and healthy thing to do, to have a moment, to have a conversation where we could see each other, hear each other's perspective, and try to embrace one another with the common dignity that God requests of us as human beings. We should have enough guts to walk through life in faithfulness, to want to try to meet in the middle with someone that we've been at odds with, even if it's been years since we have spoken to them, at least to have one attempt to try to patch things up. And that's where we get to the end of Psalm 23. To put it in a nutshell, Psalm 23 is a psalm of worship, and it's a psalm of obedience. It charts some stops that we make along the way with God as He leads us from worship service to worship service. And as we do so, we begin to grow in some different areas of our life, recognizing that God's hand's upon us, and we're making some different choices in life because God is helping us to grow up. Maybe if we continue to follow our shepherd along these different stops from worship service to worship service, we'll hear ourselves saying these things by the end of life. There I go again, tending to the needs of my soul, way before my wife and kids tell me that it's time to either take a nap or to go see someone about all the issues that I've got going on. We might say, there I go again, not flinching at the darkness that's surrounding me, neither am I provoking unnecessary conflict with the world around me. There I go again, choosing not to jump to conclusions in my relationships, choosing to do the diligent work of repairing relationships, making every effort to keep those friends who used to be so precious to me, even though we've recently have grown apart. If we say these types of things and more, we might just be able to repeat what David said towards the end of the psalm, what he says in Psalm 23, verse 6. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life. That word follow is kind of soft. Most Hebrew scholars say the better way to say it is chase me. Surely your goodness and love will chase me all the days of my life. But here's the conclusion. He is your shepherd. He is my shepherd. We are connected in this mysterious relationship with an infinite God. And He wants to lead us back and forth to worship along these different stops along the road for our benefit and for our good. So my encouragement is that we follow our shepherd, that we seek His leadership, and that we don't resist these changes that He wants to make in our life, but we see them as for our good and for our growth. Let's pray together this morning. God, we thank You that You're a good and righteous God, and we thank You that as we sense relationship being established with You, we understand that we're just up to some different things, and that these changes can be jarring at times. We used to live life one way, but now we've ordered it a different way because we're in relationship with You. So God, this day I pray for my friends, particularly who need to have a soul be restored. It's scary, it's revealing, but it's quite necessary for our growth and maturity. And so God, this day we yield to Your promises. We yield to Your leadership in our life. And I pray that Your goodness would surround us, that it would chase after us, and that Your love would abound in every single snare in our life. And as we make those first faithful steps that are scary at times on the path to recovery, would You be with us, and would You empower us for the days ahead? We ask all these things in Jesus' name, and all of God's people said, amen.
Thank you again so much for watching or listening today. Now, if this is one of your first times watching our services, here's one thing that you should know. At Ridgepoint, we do much more than just our Sunday worship services, and we have all kinds of groups, events, and classes designed to help you find and follow Jesus, and to find meaningful community of like-minded people along the way. We also want to be a resource for you with real and practical help for whatever stage of life that you're in. So if you have younger kids at home, I wanted to share one of our newer resources with you. Here in Wichita, I don't know if you know this or not, but we're really pretty lucky to have a whole bunch of really great parks and playgrounds. Now, if you're already starting to scrape the bottom of the barrel looking for things to keep your kids occupied this summer, we created a fun tournament-style bracket of the greatest parks in Wichita. Check out ridgepointwichita.com/parks to download or print the bracket, then explore 16 of our favorite parks. Take notes as you go and help us find the definitive best park in Wichita. Feel free to share this with your friends, and this might be an easy way to invite your non-church friends to check out the Ridgepoint website or meet other Ridgepoint families. And once you find your favorite, let us know. Hit us up on your favorite social media site and let us know your highlights of your park adventures. And there is much more where that came from. If you'd like to take some sort of next step in your faith, or just get to know us at Ridgepoint a little better, please take some time looking around our website for ministries that might be a good fit for you. And please feel free to reach out anytime if there's anything that we can do to serve you. For now, thanks again for spending time with us today. We'll be back here again next week with another message from Psalms with Pastor Brent, so we'll hope to see you then.